The morning they came to take my house, I was already awake. I had been awake since 4, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening to the birds starting up outside the window the way they do in late September in Ontario when the air finally turns and you can smell the leaves beginning to let go. I had lived in that house for 31 years. I knew every sound it made, the way the second stair creaked differently in winter, the particular silence of a Sunday morning, the sound of my wife Margaret's slippers on the hardwood, which I had not heard in 2 years and 4 months, and which I still listened for sometimes without meaning to. So when the knock came at 6:43, sharp and official, I set down my cup and walked to the door without hurrying. There were 2 of them. A constable from the OPP detachment in Barrie, young enough that I could remember being older than him when I was still working, and behind him on my front walkway, my nephew Derek, wearing a jacket I didn't recognize and a smile I recognized all too well. Standing beside Derek was his girlfriend Cassandra, and she was holding her phone up, filming. The constable held out an envelope. "Mr. Whitfield? Walter Whitfield?" "That's me," I said. "I have a civil enforcement order here. Sir, I need you to review it." Derek called out from the walkway. "Don't take too long, Uncle Walt. We've got people coming at 9 to change the locks." I took the envelope. I did not look at Derek. I looked at the constable, who was already uncomfortable, and I said, "Officer, do you know who held this property before the name on that order?" He glanced at his paperwork. The previous registered owner appears to be a Margaret Ann Whitfield, deceased. "And do you know what I did for 32 years before I retired?" He looked up at me. "I was a forensic accountant," I said, "primarily for the Ontario Securities Commission, and secondarily, whenever they asked me, for the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit." I folded the envelope carefully and held it back out to him. "I suggest you take a very close look at the notarization date on that transfer document before this goes any further." His face changed. Behind him, Derek's smile did not disappear exactly. It just became less certain of itself. "I want to tell you how I got to that morning, because it didn't happen the way you might think. It didn't happen because I was careless or naive. It happened because I loved my sister, and because grief makes you want to hold your family close, and because some people understand that and use it. My name is Walter Whitfield. I am 67 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, the older of 2 children. My sister Patricia was 4 years younger than me, and from the time she was small, she had a talent for finding herself in difficult situations and an equally reliable talent for finding her way out of them. We were close, in the way that siblings become close when they're the only constants in each other's lives. Our parents moved often. Our father worked the mines. Patricia and I learned early that what mattered was each other. She married a man named Gerald Kowalski when she was 24. Gerald was a decent man, not particularly ambitious, but steady. And he and Patricia had 1 child, Derek, in 1989. I was at the hospital when Derek was born. I held him when he was 40 minutes old. That matters, I think, in terms of understanding what came later. Margaret and I never had children. It wasn't something either of us chose exactly. It was more that the years went by and the decision made itself, the way some decisions do. We built a life that was full in other ways. We had the house in Innisfil, 20 minutes from the lake. We had 30 years of Saturday mornings at the farmer's market in Barrie. We had a garden that Margaret tended with an engineer's precision and a poet's eye. And we had each other, which turned out to be enough, and more than enough. I retired from the OSC in 2019 at 64. Margaret was diagnosed 8 months later. She lasted 14 months after the diagnosis. She was organized about it in the way she was organized about everything. She made sure the will was updated, that the beneficiary designations were correct, that I knew where every document was and what every account contained. She sat me down 3 weeks before the end and walked me through everything with a spreadsheet she had made, and I held her hand and tried to pay attention. And mostly what I remember is the light in the room and the way her voice stayed steady, even when mine didn't. She died on a Tuesday in March 2022. She was 63 years old. Patricia came for the funeral and stayed for a week, and that week mattered more to me than I could easily say. Derek came too, with Cassandra, and they were attentive and kind, and helped with the arrangements, and I was grateful. When they left, I told them both that they were welcome at the house any time. I meant it. I want to be clear about that. I meant every word of it. Patricia called me often in the months after Margaret died. She was going through difficulties of her own. Gerald had been ill for some time. a slow cardiac decline that the doctors were managing but not solving, and the costs were accumulating in the way medical costs do even with coverage, the small things that add up. She mentioned it carefully, not asking, just sharing, the way she always had. I sent money when I could. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like what family does. In November of 2022, Patricia called me on a Sunday evening and asked if we could talk about something serious. She explained that Gerald's condition had changed. He needed a procedure that wasn't covered, and the cost was significant, and she had already depleted most of what they had saved. She was not asking me to give her money, she said. She was asking if I would consider a short-term loan, something she could repay within 2 years once Gerald was stable and she could return to work full-time. The amount she mentioned was $40,000. I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about Derek being born and Patricia sitting in the hospital chair and the way she had laughed at something I said, and the way that laugh had always made me feel like we were still kids in Sudbury, like no time had passed at all. I thought about Margaret, who had liked Patricia enormously and had made me promise once, during one of our last good evenings together, that I would not become one of those people who locked themselves away from the people who loved them. I transferred the money on a Thursday morning. What I did not know, and would not know for some time, was that Gerald's procedure had already been completed. It had been covered. The $40,000 went somewhere else entirely. Gerald died in April of 2023, and Patricia called me crying, and I grieved with her, and I did not think about the money because grief doesn't leave much room for arithmetic. Derek came to the funeral and stayed in the house for 4 days, and Cassandra came with him, and they were helpful in the practical ways that I was not particularly capable of being helpful in just then. Derek fixed the eaves trough that had been pulling away from the fascia since August. He mowed the lawn without being asked. He seemed, for those 4 days, like exactly the nephew I had always believed him to be. The conversation happened on the last evening before they drove back to Mississauga. We were sitting on the back porch. The sun was going down behind the tree line, and the lake was turning that particular shade of copper it gets in April. And Derek said, carefully, that he had been thinking about my situation. He was worried about me being alone in such a large house. He thought it might make sense, practically speaking, for me to think about something smaller, more manageable. He wasn't suggesting anything immediate. He just wanted me to know that he and Cassandra had talked about it, and if I ever wanted to move closer to them, they would help with the transition. I said I appreciated the thought. He said there was something else he wanted to mention. He had been looking at some options, just preliminary, and he wondered if I had given any thought to how the house would be handled eventually. He mentioned that there could be significant probate costs, tax implications, complications for whoever inherited. He mentioned that some people in my situation chose to handle those things proactively, while they were still in good health and good mind, to spare their families difficulty later. I said I had a will and a lawyer and that everything was in order. He said, of course. He wasn't suggesting otherwise. He was just wondering if I'd considered a joint tenancy arrangement, or a transfer with life interest reserved, something that would protect me while simplifying things downstream. He said Patricia had mentioned I might be open to it. I looked at him for a moment. The light was very nice. The copper on the lake had deepened to something closer to bronze. I said I would think about it. What I actually did, starting the next morning, was begin paying attention in a different way. I have spent my entire career looking at documents that were designed to look correct. Forged signatures, altered dates, fabricated notarizations, transactions structured to obscure their purpose. I am not a suspicious person by nature, but I am a trained one, and the conversation on the porch had activated something in me that I should have listened to more immediately. I called my lawyer, a woman named Helen Marchetti in Barrie, and I told her about the conversation. She listened carefully and said that nothing Derek had described was inherently problematic, but that I should not sign anything or agree to anything without her reviewing it first. She said this in the tone of someone who had seen these situations before and did not enjoy seeing them. I said I understood. What I didn't tell Helen was that I had already started making notes. The calls from Patricia resumed in May, and they had a different quality to them now. There was more urgency, more specificity. She mentioned again that she was struggling financially. She mentioned that Derek was worried about me. She mentioned several times, in different ways, that the house in Innisfil was worth considerably more than it had been when Margaret and I bought it, that property values in the Barrie corridor had increased significantly, and that it seemed a shame to have so much value sitting in a single asset when there were better arrangements to be made. I listened. I took notes. I did not indicate that I was taking notes. In June, Patricia asked if she could visit. I said yes. She came alone, without Derek, and she stayed for a long weekend, and it was in many ways like old times. The two of us cooking in the kitchen and watching the water in the evenings and talking about Sudbury and our parents and Gerald and Margaret. On the Saturday afternoon, she brought out a folder of documents she said she'd had prepared, a financial planning consultation. She called it Things to Consider. Inside the folder was a draft deed transfer for the Innisfil property, transferring ownership to Derek, with a life interest clause reserving my right to remain in the house. I read through it slowly at the kitchen table. Patricia made tea. The draft had been prepared by someone, but not by anyone I knew. The lawyer named on the document was a firm in Mississauga I had never heard of. I said I would need to have Helen look at it before I could consider it. Patricia said, of course. Naturally, take all the time I needed. I photocopied every page before she left. Helen called me 4 days after I sent her the copies. Her voice had the particular flatness it got when she was containing something. She said the draft was, on its face, a legitimate document, but she had some concerns. The life interest clause contained language that would allow the new owner to challenge my continued occupancy under certain defined circumstances. Circumstances that were described vaguely enough to be applied broadly. She said that if I signed this document, I would be transferring legal ownership of my home while retaining only a conditional right to remain in it, a right that could be contested. She said she would not advise me to sign it. I said I had no intention of signing it. She said she was glad to hear that. Then she paused and said, "Walter, is there something else going on here?" I told her what I had been noticing. The calls, the escalating urgency, the framing, the way Patricia had started to seem less like my sister having a difficult time, and more like someone following a script. Helen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she wanted to refer me to a colleague of hers, a lawyer who specialized in estate litigation and elder financial abuse. She said she hoped she was wrong about what this looked like. She wasn't wrong. The colleague's name was Robert Adesanya, and he was thorough in the way that people who have seen the worst of human behavior become thorough. He asked me to compile everything I had, the bank records, the correspondence, the copies of the draft documents, the notes I had been keeping since April. He reviewed them over 2 weeks and then asked to meet. He told me that the transfer Patricia had presented was not the only document in circulation. Through contacts he had in the land registry system, he had found evidence that a transfer application had already been filed. Not the draft I had reviewed, a completed application, bearing what appeared to be my signature, dated 3 weeks prior. I had not signed any transfer document. Robert showed me the signature on the application. It was a reasonable imitation of my signature. Not perfect, but plausible enough to pass a routine review. He said we needed to move carefully. He said we needed to build the record completely before we acted, because if we moved too quickly, we would only solve part of the problem, and the rest would reconstitute itself. He said this was not his first case of this kind, and that patience was the most important tool we had. I was 66 years old, and my house was already in someone else's name, on paper, and I had not known it. I want to tell you what that feels like. Not the anger, which came, but what came before the anger. There is a specific kind of cold that settles in when you realize that someone you loved has been performing love while doing something irreversible. It is not grief exactly, though it is adjacent to grief. It is something closer to the sensation of finding out that a memory you relied on was never what you thought it was. Patricia had sat in my kitchen and made tea and looked at me with her eyes that were the same as our mother's eyes, and she had been managing me. She had been executing a plan. I do not know how long the plan had existed. I suspect it began before Gerald died. I suspect, but cannot prove, that some portion of the $40,000 had been used to establish the groundwork. I may never know all of it. What I do know is what Robert and I built over the following 3 months. Robert engaged a forensic document examiner, a woman named Christine Park, who had testified in court proceedings across the province, to analyze the signature on the transfer application. Christine's analysis was methodical and extensive. She compared the questioned signature against 47 confirmed exemplars of my signature from various documents spanning 15 years. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the transfer application had not been made by the same person who made the exemplars. Separately, we examined the notarization. The transfer application had been notarized by a commissioner of oaths in Mississauga. Robert contacted the commissioner directly, representing himself only as conducting a routine verification. The commissioner, when asked to confirm the date and circumstances of the notarization, provided an account that did not align with the date on the document. The commissioner's records showed no appointment on that date. When Robert explained what he was investigating, the commissioner immediately agreed to provide a sworn statement. The application was fraudulent. The signature was forged. The notarization was fabricated. Robert filed the materials with the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit in September. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Sergeant Michelle Tremblay, and she was, in the quiet and methodical way of good investigators, devastating. She interviewed the Commissioner of Oaths, Christine Park, the Mississauga lawyer, whose firm name had appeared on the draft document Patricia had brought me. She interviewed Derek and Cassandra separately. She interviewed Patricia. I was not present for any of these interviews, but Robert kept me informed. In December, Patricia called me. It was the first time she had called since September. Her voice sounded the way it sounds when someone has been crying recently and is trying not to let on. She said she wanted to explain. She said things had gotten out of hand. She said Derek had pushed her, had told her it was the practical thing, that I had more than I needed and they needed it more, that I would still have the house to live in and wouldn't notice the difference in practical terms. She said she hadn't understood how far Derek had taken it. I listened. I had learned, over those months, to listen without speaking. She said she was sorry. I said I knew. She said she hoped that meant I forgave her. I said I needed some time. What happened in the courts is a matter of record, so I will tell it plainly. Derek was charged with fraud over $5,000, uttering a forged document, and breach of trust. Cassandra, whose role had been primarily facilitative, she had introduced Derek to the lawyer in Mississauga and had been present when the Commissioner of Oaths was approached. With the fabricated document, was charged as a party to the offense. Patricia was charged with fraud over $5,000 for her role in the scheme, including the original $40,000, the nature of which became clear during the investigation. The fraudulent transfer was nullified by court order. The title to my house was restored. Derek received a sentence of 14 months in a provincial facility, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. Cassandra received a conditional sentence of 12 months to be served in the community with strict conditions. Patricia, given her age, her cooperation with investigators after she retained her own counsel, and her lack of prior criminal record, received a suspended sentence with 3 years of probation, 250 hours of community service, and an order to repay the $40,000 with interest. The repayment order is, practically speaking, difficult to enforce. I understand that. On the morning the constable came to my door, none of this had happened yet. The investigation was ongoing, the charges were weeks away from being laid, and Derek did not know, could not have known that the fraudulent transfer had already been identified and flagged by the registry. He had likely received some notification that the application was under review and interpreted it as a bureaucratic delay rather than an unraveling. When I told the constable about my background and asked him to look at the notarization date, what happened in the next 20 minutes was this. He called his supervisor. His supervisor called the Civil Enforcement Office. The Civil Enforcement Office pulled the application status and found the fraud flag that had been placed on it by Robert's filing, and the enforcement order was suspended pending review. Derek stood on my walkway for 20 minutes while this happened. Cassandra kept filming for about 5 minutes and then stopped. By the time the constable told Derek that the enforcement action was suspended and that he and his legal representative would be contacted by the registry, Derek's face had gone through several changes that I found instructive to observe. He did not look at me directly when he left. Patricia did not come to the sentencing. I was told she was unwell. I went alone and sat in the courtroom and watched Derek stand before the judge, and I thought about him at 40 minutes old, the weight of him, the particular warm solidity of a new person, the way he had looked at nothing in particular with the unfocused eyes of the newly arrived. I drove home along the lake. The water was doing something nice in the late afternoon light. I want to say something to anyone who is watching this, and who has family members you love and trust with the practical details of your life, with your finances, with the documents that hold your home and your savings in place. Trust is not naivety. Caring for the people you love is not weakness. What happened to me was not a failure of my character. It was a deliberate exploitation of the good faith that families are supposed to run on. But I want you to know something specific, something I learned from 32 years of looking at documents that were designed to deceive. Every forgery leaves a record somewhere. Every fabricated notarization has a real notary who did not sign it. Every transaction that appears on paper has a corresponding absence somewhere in the real world, an appointment that was never made, a phone call that was never logged, a date that doesn't align. The people who do these things count on you being too trusting, too grieved, too overwhelmed to look for those absences. Look for them anyway. Talk to your lawyer before you sign anything involving your property, your estate, your finances. Not after, before. Keep copies of your important documents somewhere that is known to a person you trust entirely and who has no financial stake in your affairs. If someone you love begins talking to you with urgency and specificity about your assets while you are in a period of grief or difficulty, write down what they say. Not because you assume the worst, because the written record is the thing that protects you if the worst turns out to be true. Margaret used to say that the most important financial instrument she had ever seen was a spiral notebook with everything written in it. She was right. She was right about most things. The garden she planted is still going. I have had to learn which things need cutting back and which things need to be left alone, and I have made mistakes in both directions. But the bones of what she built are strong, and most of it comes back in the spring, whether I deserve it or not. I am still in my house. I still have the coffee in the mornings, and the light on the water in the evenings, and the second stair that creaks differently in winter. They did not take any of it. They tried, and they did not take any of it. And I want you to remember that the next time someone makes you feel like your age, or your grief, or your trust in the people you love makes you easy to defeat. It doesn't. It doesn't have to.